Joining us now is Dr. Geoffrey Friesen, an associate professor of finance at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. And Dr. Friesen, your areas of expertise include behavioral finance, mutual fund performance, business ethics, and the application of Catholic social teaching to economics and finance. And we're going to have a chance to talk about all of that during this conversation. But I kind of want to start out by just talking about you and your Catholic faith, which I'm sure influences the work that you do. So how does your Catholic faith fit into all of this?
That's a great question. I haven't always been Catholic, and my faith hasn't always influenced my work the way it does now. I would say that over time, it has come to do so more and more, in part because of a conversation I had with a student maybe 10 years ago. And it started in class, and we were talking about an investment strategy and the way in which we typically think about what makes an investor tick and what leads to investment decisions. And the student said, well, Professor Friesen, I understand that, but is that how I should be thinking about this as a concerned citizen and person? And it caused me, that little moment gave me pause, and I realized, it provided this aha moment in some sense that showed me that my economic worldview, my financial worldview, what I was teaching was built upon a certain set of assumptions, and those were not the same assumptions that animated my view as a Catholic. And so for me, one of the ways the Catholic faith has influenced or challenged me is to think both more deeply about what is it that the Catholic Church teaches, and what is it that the Catholic Church asserts to be true about the human condition, and then what does that look like? Does that look differently if we put that into an economic model, and if so, what does that look like? Yeah.
So you have economics and finance, and you have Catholic social teaching, not the most obvious of pairings for a finance professor to start looking into a little bit. What was it that motivated you to do that, and what are some of the big takeaways you say that you have learned from doing so?
The first motivation was the reading of the encyclical Rerum Novarum. And I only stumbled into that because I was volunteered to help coach a homeschool high school speech and debate team. And the speech and debate resolution for that year happened to be, it was something like the following: in the realm of economics, freedom ought to be valued above equity. And so I knew the freedom side pretty well, and we read Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom. I had become Catholic a few years before, and so started looking around for the issue of fairness or justice or equity in the world of economics. And always to that point, I had been influenced by perhaps the view that the popes speak on matters of faith and morals, but when it comes to economics, they should leave that to the economists. That's kind of the view that I had picked up along the way. And I read Rerum Novarum and immediately was struck by how deeply relevant the questions were, and how I had never encountered these in any of my schooling. So that was what started everything. I think a second influence was a seminar that I attended put on by the Lumen Christi Institute in 2019. It was in Jerusalem, and there were a number of faculty there. It was on Catholic social teaching and economic thought. And these were some of the top economists in really in the country who were there, and that provided almost like the permission and the legitimacy to think seriously about these issues in finance and economics. And so that was really an important event for me, that it sort of signaled to me or showed me that it's possible to be a serious economist or finance academic and think seriously or desire to integrate these issues into one's teaching and scholarship. And so that was a second real inspiration, I suppose, for me. And then the third is something that I always encourage in all of my students, and that is to strive for an integrated life. And the church teaching suggests that at the core of many of our social diseases, and this includes business scandals, is a divided life between what one professes to believe and one's actions, or how one acts on Sunday and the other days of the week. And so regardless of what their wisdom tradition is, and I tell them, I'm very transparent about the Catholic lens through which I see the world, but it's not so important that they adopt my lens, but that the students are able to and are given permission to own their own wisdom tradition, or whatever that framework is, and integrate that with their ethical worldview. And for me, the Catholic worldview provides the most coherent integration for me that I've yet encountered. And so I'm open about that with my students, but also recognize that they have the right to their own value system. And what's most important, at least initially, is that process of integrating their financial and economic worldview with their moral worldview and foundation. Yeah.
So big picture, would you say capitalism is the economic framework that's most in line with Catholicism, and how does that compare with some of the other ones, whether it's socialism or communism?
I think one of the really interesting things that I encountered was the view of the different popes in the church teaching through time regarding capitalism, socialism, etc. If you go back to Rerum Novarum, the idea of private property, which is a central tenet of capitalism, that capital is owned by private individuals or institutions. I don't know that sacrosanct would be the right word. I don't think that's the word Leo XIII used, but it is of paramount importance. At the same time, the idea that shareholders owe a singular duty to it, or that firms owe a singular duty to their shareholders, really doesn't necessarily find deep roots in Catholic social teaching. And so we hear a lot about the elusive third way. You've got on the one extreme communism and Marxism, on the other hand what some might call unfettered capitalism. Yes, in some ways the private property aspect of capitalism is an essential ingredient. But what do we need for markets to function? We need private ownership, we need transparency, we need clarity on the rules of law and the enforcement. But if you go back to Adam Smith, and further, but go back to Smith, 1776, or the theory of moral sentiments, he also emphasized we need virtuous actors. And so that virtue finds its home squarely in Catholic social teaching. But when we use the term capitalism, that in and of itself may or may not convey anything about virtuous actors. And so that term means different things to different people. It's like any economic system, it depends upon really where its roots are planted, what that anthropological soil looks like. And so if there's no virtue in the soil, then the plants are going to grow up to be, to look different and be, in my opinion, less healthy than when that virtue is there. So, yes and no. Or like, as any economist would say, it depends.
Yes, exactly. Well, let me ask you this. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops has weighed in and developed some guidelines for socially responsible investing. And I want to list a few of them. They include investing in companies, not investing in companies involved with abortion, contraception, pornography, weapons production, human rights violations, and activities that harm the environment. There would be some obvious companies that you would want to avoid given that list. But how easy, knowing that no company is perfect, is to go in and base your investment strategy on avoiding companies that avoid all of these things? Is that realistic for an investor?
I mean, it's certainly realistic to do. There's a cost to doing it, and there's always a subjective degree of judgment. Certainly, I would agree with, for me, personally, the desire to avoid any entanglement with the abortion industry or the fetal tissue industry or the contraception industry. Then you get into issues like just war theory and sometimes, or tobacco or alcohol. And there are subjective value judgments to be made. In some cases, it's black and white within church teaching. In other cases, you can have two very sincere Catholics who disagree on a particular issue. Should I invest in Raytheon or Lockheed Martin? And they may come to different conclusions, but it's certainly possible to do. I don't think that that means that there is one absolute clear-cut black and white set of companies that absolutely every sincere Catholic must invest in these and no others, because again, like issues like just where theory or are issues where sincere Catholics may have some disagreement. I think for me, Pope Francis talks about this in Benedict, that every economic act is a moral act. And so investing is one important channel through which we can influence companies, because in some sense we're withholding the capital that's provided to those companies. Our consumer choices are a second one, and for me that's an even more difficult one to, in some cases, enact or be aware of, because we live in such an active consumer society. But if we think about the lifeblood that we're cutting off, our consumer choices actually may have an even more immediate, greater impact. So I think of that, I really respect what the Church has taught, and I think that those guidelines are absolutely ethically and financially sound and valid. I think our consumer choices also make a difference, and that's an area that I would also like to see more, more articulation on, in some sense, from the bishops in the future.
I think that's an important distinction, the consumerism versus an investor, because as an investor, especially a small investor, you may be dealing with 20 or 30 shares, and realistically, a company isn't going to pay a whole lot of attention to somebody sitting there with 20 or 30 shares if you try to make a principled stand. So maybe being a consumer and focusing more on consumer versus investing would be a great way to approach that.
I think so, and we can get into the weeds a little bit if you want, but if I go out and buy stock, say in Apple Corporation, there are two ways that Apple deals with stock. If they issue new stock to the public, then that's a form of fundraising, and that capital from the new shareholders goes into the company. But more often than not, I'm simply buying the stock on what's called a secondary exchange. And so Apple's not directly receiving any new money when I buy their stock. It's simply trading hands, and I do have an ownership and therefore a connection to the company. Let's certainly not deny that, and receive dividends or other forms of income through that stock. But in terms of direct benefit to the company or direct harm to the company, it may be more direct harm to Apple if I refuse to buy an iPhone and an iWatch than if I refuse to invest in their already issued stock that's trading on the secondary markets. That's just my point. Both are important, clearly. Yeah.
Let's talk about the concept of stewardship, that everything that we have, everything is a gift from God. We're not the ultimate owners of the resources. So using that mindset, can we take it to the extreme and say, is it wrong to accumulate any kind of wealth? Should we be living the St. Francis lifestyle where we're giving everything away? Or where do we draw that line where it's okay to have some wealth to retire comfortably or to send the kids to college?
Yeah, I mean, what comes immediately to mind is the parable of the talents and the stewards who were given, I think, 10, 5, and one talent. And those who were given the 10 and the 5 invested them or put them to productive use and were commended. The one who had only one, I think, buried it and was chastised for not having put it to productive use. And so I think that this idea of the universal destination of goods, or the idea that we're stewards of resources that were not of our own creation, that preceded us and that will stay after us, it doesn't mean that we cannot engage with those. And I mean, my view is one of the ways we engage with that is through the ownership of property. But understanding the purpose, or the telos, or the end goal of that ownership is critical. If the end goal is just my own self-preservation, my own advancement of, and my own consumption, that's going to lead to a different set of choices and investments than if my view is these are resources that have been entrusted to me, and I'm to make the most of them for the greatest good. I mean, then that's a prudential judgment. Does that mean sending my children to college? It certainly might. Does that mean buying a car so that I can reliably get to work? It might. Does that mean, what does that mean? That's a value judgment, and no two people will approach it exactly the same way. But there's nothing, to my mind, contrary to the gospel or Catholic teaching about being industrious or entrepreneurial or creating genuine wealth. I mean, the church teaches goods that are truly good and services that truly serve are, in some sense, inherent and desirable. And profit and money, in some sense, is like the oxygen in the business environment. Mm-hmm. So profit's not a dirty word. It's like it may not be the be-all and end-all. So the analogy I like to use is, if I had a blood oxygen monitor on my finger and it showed up at 98 or 99%, that would show you that I'm in a state of health, probably. But I wouldn't say that maximizing my oxygen is my goal in life. Like, I don't exist as a human to maximize that. It's a byproduct of a living healthy. And profit is like the oxygen in the business environment. In order to have flourishing communities, societies, businesses, the profit is necessary. But just like I wouldn't say I exist to maximize my blood oxygen, mm-hmm. because if I did that, I wouldn't go to the YMCA and work out strenuously, because during that time it drops a little bit. Mm-hmm. In the long run, it's good for me, but in the short run, if I just tried to maximize that all the time, it would lead me astray. So too, if I take the view that the purpose of a business is to maximize the profit, that's going to lead the company astray. It's going to, in the same way, foreclose certain possibilities or investments that in the long run will lead to productive, flourishing outcomes, but in the short run, may not look like they're maximizing the immediate profitability. So, mm-hmm. so to go back to your question, no, I don't think my view is private property is what did Winston Churchill say? Democracy is a terrible system. It's just better than any of the others. It's the mechanism by which we take these resources and allocate responsibility for them to individuals and take ownership and take responsibility of our duties, or at least it allows us to do that if we choose to do that. So in that sense, I think that's my reading of why Leo XIII emphasized the importance and necessity of private property as a precondition for mm-hmm. healthy economies. Mm-hmm.
You said at the beginning of our conversation something along the lines of, you can invest from a Catholic perspective, but you have to understand going in that there's going to be a cost to doing that. Does that mean it's harder as a Catholic to be successful in investing, or do we just have to be smarter?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a good question. There's a long-standing debate in finance and in investing about whether one can do well by doing good. So first of all, there will be others out there who will agree with me and others who disagree that there is always a cost to discipleship. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it is the case that by screening companies, you actually get the well-run companies who are run by virtuous leaders. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that their performance is at or even superior to the overall market. So it's not always the case that there's a cost, but I think that as Catholics, we should be prepared for the possibility that there's a cost. That is, we should not enter into a values-based investment with the presupposition that it's always going to work out as well or better as long as I do the right thing. Sometimes there is a cost to doing the right thing. So I think it can be harder in that sense because there's the possibility that one does have to forego the returns associated with investments that conflict with mm-hmm. or run afoul of Catholic teaching. We also have to be smarter about it. I agree. That's a third thing. Or a second thing, but a third thing, and the church, there's a document, Mensurum Bonum, which I think roughly is translated in full measure. And it really challenges our idea as investors in a third way, and that is to assume that necessarily maximizing my financial returns is and should be the only outcome of my capital. And so I think that we need to be smarter, but we also need to be wiser mm-hmm. in a certain sense that capital, of course it can and should be used to generate positive and healthy returns. But capital also has other power or influence, if you want to think about it that way. And there are other legitimate aims or ends that can go along with financial returns. So I think not only being smarter, but being wiser and understanding that to the extent that there's a financial cost associated with discipleship, there may also be, at the same time, spiritual or relational or personal benefits that don't come in the form of a higher, annual average return, but nevertheless are real and may actually result from our having made those choices. So smarter and wiser.
Yeah. Do you think the church says enough, does enough, preaches enough about how we should be investing our money, or should the church say anything at all about that?
Well, on the one hand, my friends who have said, the popes should stay within the realm of theology and philosophy and just stay out of economics have a point. I don't know that this church would necessarily benefit from, or Catholics would necessarily benefit from, more investment portfolio advice from the church. So I don't know that they need to do more of that. But I think my view, and one of the things that drew me to the Catholic Church, was the depth of the depth and clarity of the philosophical and theological teaching. So I think that there is a valid case to be made that the church does have a duty to continue framing issues of economic or financial matters at the level of first principles. And because oftentimes in the modern investment world, we lose sight of the reality that a lot of our technical apparatus in finance or economics is built upon a very reduced form of the human person as a rational, optimal, self-interested agent with really no transcendent or theological dimension. And so to the extent that we're saying, if we want to make the case that the church needs to stay completely out of matters economic and financial, which I don't make that case, to me, what that's really saying is I accept more or less whole cloth this view of man or the human person that economics and finance presents. To the extent that we don't, and I'm not saying that's wrong, but I'm saying that's incomplete in my opinion. To the extent that that's incomplete, then we need assistance or guidance from the outside to fill in those gaps. And that's where I think, to me, the philosophical and theological and moral teachings bear weight. To the extent that they elicit strong responses from practitioners in business or economics or finance, it may be partly because the theologians are out of touch with business, but it may also be because the investors or the business persons have adopted, maybe unwittingly, a false view of what it means to be human and to act in an economic environment. And so I think there's some of both of that, some truth in both of those.
Pope Francis is quoted as saying, money should serve, not govern. So what is your advice to the average Catholic out there in that they're not getting too consumed with the bottom line on their 401k and that they're missing the things that they should be concentrating on life? How do you come up with that balance of, I want to be a good Catholic, but I also have to protect my family and think about the family?
Well, I have to start with the caveat that I'm not a financial investor, so this is not financial advice. To me, a lot of it comes down to means and ends, and first and second things. Interesting that you bring this up. I had a student do a term paper, and her term paper was on the difference between male and female advisors. Is this Catholic? Not really Catholic, but one of the things she pointed out was that male financial advisors will tend to start with a portfolio and look at how can we optimize this portfolio from a risk-return standpoint and give you the best portfolio for your money. And she said, in general, female advisors will tend to start with goals, with values, and then tailor a financial plan to that. Now, that's neither Catholic or non-Catholic, but it illustrates what I think in finance sometimes happens, and that is we invert the means and the ends. I agree, Pope Francis is talking about money should serve. It should be an instrument towards some greater or broader goal or end that is inherently good. And I think that if we keep that order in mind, there's nothing wrong with having a well-ordered, well-defined set of goals and ends that are in and of themselves inherently good, inherently valuable, and guiding our lives as Catholics. Our resources, including our investments, should serve that, should be an instrument towards achieving that. And so long as I think we keep that ordering in perspective, to me that's a healthy ordering. Where we run into trouble is when we invert the means and ends, and our society, our culture, our financial press encourage us to elevate our 401k or elevate our quote-unquote retirement goals, often reduced to financial metrics, to an end goal. That I think is certain to backfire. C.S. Lewis once said, if you put first things first, you get second things thrown in. If you put second things first, you lose both the first and the second things. This is like a great paradox that, and it exists and applies to finance and investing as well. So I think the right ordering of means and ends, and seeing our investments as a means to some other end that we have to define, that seems to me a good or a sound way to live in right relationship with our money and investments.
So I want to ask you, most Catholics are people of faith who work in a secular environment. You yourself, Associate Professor of Finance at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, you do that as well. What advice do you have on how to handle it when the secular worldview, the culture, starts to come into conflict with your Catholic faith in the workplace? Any advice there?
I mean, in some ways, I have it easy at a secular university. And on the one hand, there's a lot of we'll call it viewpoint diversity here. And many of the things that I believe others may disagree with, but at the same time, the university is unique in that it provides a pretty broad blanket of First Amendment protection. And in fact, in its healthiest sense, and I think generally that's true here at the university, encourages intellectual diversity, where ideas kind of battle it out in the marketplace, and may the best idea win. And so in that sense, I've had it easier than many people as I've come to better know and integrate my Catholic faith. I'm in an environment where I've come to see that the only real censor of my speech is going to be self-censorship. And so, but for me, that self-censorship is very powerful. And so to the extent that I'm not comfortable or I don't know why I believe what I believe, and that's been the case for a good part of my career, I've tended to not be very vocal because I didn't feel like I really could go to the mat and say, this is what I believe, this is why I believe it, and I'm not going to change unless I'm presented compelling evidence that convinces me otherwise, which would be a pretty high bar. But many of my friends who work in business places, don't necessarily have that same luxury, and so I think always one, for me, knowing what I believe and why I believe it. For me, I've come to find it very helpful to rehearse, like my not a scripted canned response, but to anticipate what are the legitimate challenges or objections, and how would I respond in a charitable but authoritative way. That's helped me immensely, I think, in dealing with issues of conflict, which certainly exist and abound here at the university, but finding a way to engage them charitably, but also knowing what I believe and not apologizing for those. I think also, one thing that I've come to just see in conversations with many people is that every institution has its own culture, its own ethos, its own embedded value system. And so, to the extent that it's possible, aligning yourself with an organization where the values are either explicitly or maybe even tacitly supportive of what you view or what your viewpoint is, can be very helpful. Swimming downstream versus swimming upstream.
Right. Yeah. You're also the faculty advisor for the Thomistic Institute here at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. Tell me a little bit more about that organization. I know you've got some great speakers you're bringing in this year.
It's a great organization. My friend and well, he's an actual philosopher. I trespass in the areas of philosophy. Dr. Patrick Callahan over at the Newman Institute for Thought and Culture was really instrumental in helping a group of students and I, as the faculty advisor, get this chapter up and running. So it's the Thomistic Institute chapter is a local chapter. It's a registered student organization, or RSO, which means it's an official student group here on campus. And it's a chapter of the National Thomistic Institute, which is run out of the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. And the goal of the Institute is to bring high caliber, nationally known speakers to campus to engage in issues that are related to Catholic teaching or Thomistic philosophy. So each fall and spring we have probably 2 or 3. This fall we have 3 speakers coming in talking on issues as diverse as private property ownership in November. October, I think we have the humanities and Shakespeare. One of the great things about the Thomistic Institute is it's free. These events are free and open to the public, to the university community, and they really allow or provide a dimension of formation that I think is complementary to many of the other dimensions of formation on campus, like through the Newman Center, and that is really the intellectual core of the Catholic tradition. And so my own view is that the university is here to develop the whole person, body, mind, heart, soul. And the mind part is something that is historically a challenge in secular universities to engage in serious intellectual inquiry that's not hostile to the Catholic faith or to the Christian faith. So the Thomistic Institute is really set up to bring these speakers to campus and present a really compelling, coherent, rigorous, academically grounded platform for thinking about and discussing these issues. They also sponsor a number of book studies and study groups, the Thomistic Institute, here on campus. And so it's not just the speakers, but those are some of the highlight events. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
So I'll end with this. When it comes to finances, when it comes to money, we can all use guidance. Sometimes we even might get in trouble with that, so we can turn to saints for intercession. And we have several saints that are associated in one way or another with finance and with money. St. Anthony advocated for those in debt. Of course, St. Matthew the Apostle was a tax collector. And St. Jude, another one, the patron saint of desperate situations. What's your advice to a Catholic? Do you have a particular saint that you turn to, whether it has to do with finance or not, that is someone you turn to and ask for intercession?
I don't have a specific saint when it comes to financial matters. Maybe I should. I think one of the beautiful things about Catholic teaching is I've come to really just appreciate, though, the power of intercession, not only from those who are here, but those who've gone on before us. And so, yeah, I don't have a specific saint, financial saint. Maybe that's the next chapter.
There you go.
Leo the 13th was really such a pivotal person, and my confirmation saint, Saint Benedict. He wasn't a financial investor, but in some sense has such simple and timeless wisdom. I suppose those are the saints or the individuals maybe to whom I offer up my struggles and questions when it comes to financial matters and how they deal with the faith.
Those are good ones. Those are very good.
So I'll rest my hat there, but I appreciate that. I'll keep my eyes open.
There you go. There you go. Well, Dr. Geoffrey Friesen, Associate Professor of Finance at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, thanks so much for your time, for sharing about finance, about Catholicism, and the intersection between the two.
You're welcome.